We are living out there in a world of information coming at you from multiple sources. One of the sources that I love watching is Dostcast. So if you guys have not subscribed to the Dostcast channel on YouTube, I suggest that you should subscribe to it because I love their content.
Yo, what is up, my friends? Welcome to another episode of Dostcast. My name is Vinamre and Ashwin. If you are new to our channel, please stay because we release new episodes every Tuesday and Friday at 12 p.m. Indian Standard Time. If you're listening to this podcast on an audio platform, make sure to give us 5 stars because we're the best in Bharat. Varsh, baby. And today's guest is a supreme, behatareen, mastermind, master stroke, amazing, beautiful. I'll stop with the adjectives. It's Ashwin Sanghi. His latest book, Magicians of Mazda, has sold over 1 million copies. मेरी अपनी पर्सनल कहानी ये है कि when I was a kid, I read the Rozabal Line by Ashwin Sanghi and actually went to one of the places he mentions in the book. That is how close this conversation is to my heart. Ashwin just blew me away with his insights on writing, the Parsis in India, and what it takes to write a fiction thriller book in India. The episode with the legendary Ashwin Sanghi begins in 3, 2, 1. Before we discuss the book, how do you keep a whole day aside? I mean, isn't your life supposed to be super busy?
No. As far as the way I work is that normally I will not do one scheduled appointment in the day.
Okay.
So if I know that, okay, I have a podcast with Vinamre, then the idea is कि भाई ठीक है, वो 11 बजे हो, 12 बजे हो, 1 बजे हो, whatever. Yeah. Then I have a lot of other routine tasks which need to get done, whether it's my writing schedule, etc. But I will not do another interview on that day. I will not unnecessarily get into another Zoom conference that day. The idea is I like to live my life in a little bit of a sort of a comfortable. I don't like a hectic.
You're not a hustler.
No, it doesn't work. एक तो मैं 5 बजे सुबह उठ जाता हूँ for my writing. So I'm already, by the time I reach 10 o'clock, half my day is already done.
Yeah.
You
and all Navy SEALs.
And then sham ko I go into my reading mode, which is all the research for the next book. So honestly speaking, in the middle of the day, which is the so-called not books but the business of books, that is something where I normally try and take on only one thing in that day. So if you tell me, oh, we were supposed to start at 11 o'clock, ये नहीं है कि मैंने 11 बजे से 1 बजे का slot रखा है, वो 1:30 हो जाए या 2 हो जाए, it's not going to affect me.
Yeah, no, I see that your day is sandwiched by these important things. मुझे लगता था कि it's a mishmash of administrative stuff और बीच में if you can sneak in something, that's good. Because the most important thing for you typically is the reading and writing, right? Everything else is...
Oh, yeah.
Everything else is just like the things you must do.
Do I need to keep this on?
No, you can take it off. Whatever.
I'm happier with it off.
ठीक है. Works. No problem. उतार के फेंक दो उसे.
नहीं, फेंक दो ना. फेंक दूंगा तो आपके. हाँ, बस. This is more comfortable and I can hear you comfortably.
Fantastic. No problem at all. So you've already had your writing done for the day.
Exactly.
That's your main thing. And then as far as these things are concerned, do you feel overtalked, especially around the release of a book? Because you're saying the same things again and again and again?
It does. Okay, now are we recording now?
Yeah, we are.
Yeah? Oh, okay. I thought we were just still having a conversation.
No, I said we were on. Yeah.
Okay. No, as far as I am concerned, honestly speaking, I love talking about my books. So you can ask me the same thing 10 times and I'll still give you the answer, but every answer will be slightly different. Because the sort of stuff that I talk about is the sort of stuff that has multiple interpretations. And that's the nature of all the books in the Bharat series. That I present you a certain narrative, but I know that there are alternative narratives. And the idea of a Bharat series book is not to push that one particular narrative down your throat. It is to tell you, look, this is what I have crafted. But if you notice, Bharat series books, unlike a lot of other fictional books, they have a very, very extensive research bibliography at the end. The idea is to be able to give you all of those multi-dimensional perspectives and say, okay, listen, if you found this story interesting, then why don't you simply just go and explore for yourself? And maybe you will agree with me, maybe you'll disagree with me. So that is precisely what I do through my writing.
I was going to say that because as a younger man, I remember I had the great fortune of actually visiting the Basilica of Bomb Jesus, something I've brought up at least 3 times before this, simply because I read it about it in your book. And I'm like, Goa ke andar the. And my family was like, where do you want to go? I was like, I just figured out how to Google. I was like, yahan zarur jana hai, right? And when we were near the crypt, it suddenly was like, I can't believe I read this in a book and I'm here. So the passages about Tehran in the book, the passages about Udvada, right? The other passages around Mumbai. This is something that I've noticed from the Rozabal Line till now. There is indeed that exploratory style. For the explorer, jo baith ke pad raha hai, I must go check these places for myself. Not for just research, but physically as well. So I see that you are kind of promoting amateur archaeologists, amateur anthropologists, which is wonderful because that doesn't often happen. You can have the most fantastical book, but there's no point if it just takes place in your mind.
Yeah. Honestly speaking, Vinamre, my entire approach has been that there are so many subjects that are interesting where scholarly research doesn't really happen because it is not mainstream. So how do you first make something mainstream so that then it leads to scholarly inquiry? So for example, the idea or the notion that Christianity could have evolved as a result of a reaction to Buddhist philosophy, or that the Sermon on the Mount or the Beatitudes could have their roots in Buddhism, was something that interested me and led to the Rozabal Line. I don't claim myself to be a historian or a theologian or a mythologist or any of that. I'm no scholar. And in that sense, I'm an amateur. So I don't say that what I am telling you in my books is true. But I'm saying that, hey, listen, I find it fascinating that if I could take the A out of Abraham and put it at the end, it gets me Brahma. And the fact that Abraham's wife is Sarah and Brahma's consort is Saraswati. So I find that interesting. Now it is for the scholars to go and dig up and see as to whether there is some material relevance to that nugget of information that I have presented. So all of my books are like that. In the Magicians of Mazda, I'm talking about the ancient connections between the Vedic age as well as Zoroastrianism. And I find those connections very, very interesting. That you have Parsis celebrating Navroz, but in the Kashmiri Pandits celebrating Navre. Or the Parsis wearing the Sadre and Kushti, and on the other hand, you have the Kashmiri Pandits wearing the Sadr. Or, for example, both worshipping the holy cow. Or that you have Athar as a central element of Zoroastrianism, which is fire, as the intermediary between humans and gods. And on the other hand, in India, we have the Atharva Veda. So there are so many elements. Mitra and Varun are given the same amount of respect within the Gathas that they are given in the Rig Veda. Or, for example, the idea that you had merchants who were touching the Gujarat coast when they were coming from Persia, and they were mostly Zoroastrians. So they were already aware of the maritime trade routes. Or the fact that the Mahabharata has a word known as Parsika, which refers to those who lived west of the Indus. Now, those are all interesting and very tantalizing nuggets of information that I present to you through the Magicians of Mazda. But please never treat me as the so-called scholarly source of this material. I'm only presenting material in an entertaining way. And then I hope that it will be entertaining enough for it to become mainstream, and then for scholars to figure out that, hey, listen, this is mainstream enough, so why don't we dig further?
Right. I have a note from here. I have a note from Magicians of Mazda around this exact kind of comparative mythology you have discussed kar rahe ho. It says, Zoroastrian Gathas, but also in the Rig Veda, their sacred fire was much like the Agni of Hindus. Their yasnas were similar to Hindu yasnas. Their Avestan verses sounded like the Vedic Sanskrit, while the Zoroastrians had Devas and Ahuras, Hindus had Devas and Asuras. How could such a similar people pose a threat to his? Jadi Rana agreed to give them sanctuary, allotting a square plot of 3 farsangs or 9 kilometers for their 9 square kilometers for their use. So Jadi Rana is the king who did he actually give solace to Parsis when they first came to India, fleeing persecution?
Whatever we know about the Parsi arrival in India comes through a work known as the Qissa-i Sanjan. Now, how much of that is real and how much of that is fictional is a matter for debate. But I'm one of those who always believes that great myths are always based on a bedrock of truth. And because there was something great that happened, or a great person that lived, which resulted in a mythology evolving around it. So if we were to take the Qissa-i Sanjan, what we find is that the Parsis actually arrived on the island of Diu about 18 years before they arrived in Sanjan.
Which we today know as Daman and Diu.
Daman and Diu, exactly. So, and in fact, there are old towers of silence in Diu, which are now open for visitors to go into because they have been deconsecrated because there are no Parsis left in Diu. So unlike the Tower of Silence in Bombay, which you can't visit, the Diu Tower of Silence is an amazing spot to visit because you can actually go into the tower itself.
And you can be quiet there. Is that the idea?
Yeah, but the Tower of Silence was basically the place for the final funeral rites of the Parsis. The Dakhmas, correct.
Yeah.
So the Dakhma is basically a circular topped flat enclosure, and it allows the Parsis to undertake what is known as a sky burial because it's at a height, and the corpse is laid out there, and natural birds of prey can come and feast on the corpse. So you can actually go and visit that in Diu because it's now deconsecrated.
Which means it's no longer being used as a tourist place?
It's no longer being used. It's a tourist spot.
Interesting.
So since you are one of those who got fascinated by the Basilica of Bom Jesus, I thought that this could become your next destination to cover.
A few nights ago, a friend of mine actually was talking about Udvada. I had no idea I would end up reading about it in the book.
There you go. So the point is, Qissa-i Sanjan shows that they came to Diu. From there, 18 years later, they moved to Sanjan. While they were on the high seas, there was a major storm, and they prayed to their god, ASURA Mazda, and said that in case we are able to make landfall safely, then we will establish a fire, a sacred fire, which then later on came to be known as the Iransha, in Sanjan. The king who was there was someone they refer to as Jadi Rana. Subsequently, historians have talked about the fact that probably Jadi Rana was a king called Vijay Aditya, one of the Chanakya kings, who welcomed them. And Vijayaditya was surprised by the fact that these people, even though they came from Persia, there were so many similarities. So it was almost as though he knew them. So he did establish certain conditions that you must speak the Gujarati language and that you must dress in local attire and so on and so forth. But he did eventually welcome them. And of course, they had to lay down their arms. And only take up arms when the king demanded. And that, of course, an incident would occur 300 or 400 years later, where Mahmud Begada, the Sultan of Gujarat, attacked Sanjan. And that's the point of time when the Parsi forces and the Hindu forces had to come together. Yeah. And so they were specifically requested to take up arms. But for me, this entire story is fascinating, not only because of the commonly accepted version that they offered a bowl of milk. The king offered a complete, a overfull bowl of milk, and they added a little sugar into it in order to say that all that we will bring is a little bit of sweetness to your land. That part of it is wonderful. But what is really fascinating is the fact that a Hindu king felt comfortable enough with these people, which means that there were enough connections, there were enough points of commonality for him to say, hey, listen, please make this your home. And that's what I've tried to bring out through the Magicians of Mazda.
Let's dial it a step back and talk about, now do you said you live in South Mumbai, so do you have Parsi friends who compelled you to start doing research on this and start writing it? Like, we have a couple of famous Parsi figures in our national narratives, right? Usually industrialists, that's the most prevalent, which I was really glad to see Farooq Bulsara, Freddie Mercury in the book, because I grew up listening to Queen. But your personal interest in covering the Parsis, right? Where did that arise from?
So the genesis of this book, actually, we have to rewind about 7 years ago.
I thought you were going to say 2,000 years, like your books.
7 years ago. 2014 is the year when Dan Brown came into India to deliver a lecture. He delivered one lecture in Delhi and then was due to deliver a second lecture in Bombay. His publishers reached out to me and said that, Ashwin, Indian press calls you the Dan Brown of India. Yeah. So therefore, instead of him delivering a lecture, we were thinking that maybe we change the format and we just have you and him chatting on stage.
Like a fireside chat of some kind?
Yeah. So we did a chat at the NCPA and it was very well received. Then after that, Dan said that, Ashwin, what are you up to for dinner? And I said, okay, if you like, we'll go and we'll sit next door at the Oberoi. So we went and sat down there for dinner. We wrapped up from there at about 2 o'clock in the morning because we had so much stuff to talk about, which excited us. And I thought that was pretty much the end of it. The next day, I received a call from him at about 11 in the morning saying, what are you up to? I said, when Dan Brown asks you, what are you up to? You say, I have nothing. So he said, no, I was just wondering whether you would have a couple of hours to show me a few exciting places in Bombay. Because whenever I visit a place, I always want to try and pick up on the one or two interesting things that are. But you know me well enough to figure out what would excite me. So I was desperately racking my brains to think about what are the places that I could take someone like Dan Brown to. And the very first place that came to my mind was the Tower of Silence in Malabar Hill. And so I ended up taking him there, and that was the very first stop. And luckily we had a few relationships where I was able to take him into the main prayer hall. Then there were a couple of priests who were able to give us a virtual tour using the model of the Dakhmas. Of course, non-Parsis as well as Parsis are not allowed to go beyond a certain point.
Can we go there today if you want? Like after this?
Yeah, you could go to the Tower of Silence, but you would only be able to go up to a point.
Okay.
Beyond that, in fact, it doesn't matter whether you're Parsi or non-Parsi. Beyond a certain point, it is only a certain sect of priests who can actually approach the real Dakhma, as it were. So we ended up seeing the Tower of Silence through the model. And then I came away and I said, there is such a thrill about being in a place like this. I can't understand, I can't fathom as to why someone has not thought about making this the core of a book.
Yeah.
Because this is just interesting. As it turns out, a year and a half later, I ended up writing a thriller with James Patterson, in which there is
Private India,
in which there's a fight sequence which happens at the Tower of Silence. But it was only one chapter in that book. But it was always parked in the back of my mind that I will one day do an entire book based on Zoroastrianism. Then, as it happens, I was on a flight a few years later, and the person sitting next to me was Baman Irani. And we started chatting. And there was enough to chat about. And I mentioned to him that, this is something that interests me. And how do you suggest I go about it? And he said, well, I would say your starting point is the Qissa-i Sanjan. Why don't you get hold of a copy and then see where it takes you? So I got off that flight, and within the next couple of days, I had already located the Qissa-i Sanjan. So once I started reading that, that's when I realized, I said, no, this is not just a story about how the Parsis came to India. No, it cannot be that. It has to be that if they came to India, were they coming back to their roots? Were they already totally familiar with the Indian subcontinent, either as sailors or as merchants, or were they actually coming back in some ways? Were they coming back home? And that's when it struck me that I need to write a story which not only talks about the arrival of the Parsis into India, but talks about the far greater ancient connections between people of the Zoroastrian faith and those who looked at dharmic faiths or Vedism, as it were.
How much of this was primary source reading and researching through WorldCat and libraries, and how much it was actually talking to contemporary Parsis?
Well, you'll be surprised. Contemporary Parsis, unfortunately, to a very great extent, because there are such limited numbers. I mean, if you look at Bombay today, the total Parsi count would be about maybe 35,000.
Yeah, you said it's about, in the book, about 100,000 people, right?
Across the world.
Across the world, yeah.
So if you looked at Bombay, it would be about 35 to 40,000. Across India, it would be around 60,000. And across the world, it would be around 100,000. So it's a minuscule number. And when you talk of contemporary Parsis, like, for example, the people I grew up with in cathedral school, they actually know very little about their own roots, as it were. They just know what is made popular through, they would know the milk in the bowl story or, that sort of stuff.
Right.
So to a very great extent, what I had to do was to actually dig into a lot of other resources, a lot of other books that could tell me. For example, the average Parsi would not necessarily be aware of the word magician and its link to the word magi. They've heard vaguely about the magi, but they would not correlate that necessarily with the birth of Jesus Christ and the fact that there were 3 wise men who were also known as magi. And the fact that those 3 wise men mentioned in the Bible could have been Zoroastrians. They will not necessarily go back into the word magi and say, well, magi is the plural, but the singular is magus. But where does that singular magus come from? They will not necessarily know that the root of that lies in a word called magha. And the word magha is used also as an adjective, maghavan, which is used to describe Lord Indra in the Rig Veda. So Maghavan basically implied anyone who had exalted powers. And so it is from the word Maghavan that you land up with the word magi, from which you land up with the word magician. Now, those sort of things I don't expect Parsi friends to be able to guide me with.
Right. So I'm just wondering, when you were doing the research for this, did the connection to Vedic traditions arrive as by accident, or were you deliberately trying to mine for it?
No, I had already covered some part of it in the Rozabal Line. So some part of it, like for example, the most commonly accepted connections are the tremendous overlaps between the Avestan language and Sanskrit. So that is a well-known fact. That you can read the two, you can read the Gathas and you can read the Vedas, and you will find that they pretty much sound almost the same, except for the inflection points. Tam avantam yajatam. So now the only difference between that line in the Vedas and that line in the Gathas is the inflection points. The J becomes Z and the S becomes H. That's all. Otherwise, you can read those two lines identically. And they mean the same thing. The great Lord, the great God. So those were very, very commonly accepted overlaps. Similarly, the overlaps in terms of the deities, Varun and Mitra, and the fact that when Varun was worshipped, then Mitra, his friend, was also worshipped.
Right.
And the Romans then went on to only start worshipping Mitra. So the Rigvedic Mitra became a Roman god in some ways. So those were also well-established overlaps. But similarly, for example, the nature of the Asuras and Ahuras, or the Daivas and the Devas, that's again something which has been talked about often enough. And I had even talked about it in the Rozabal Line. That how did something like what is worshipped as a benevolent force in Zoroastrianism, that is the Asura or the Ahura, is actually looked at as a malevolent force within later Hinduism.
Right.
So those parts of the overlaps were already there. What I found most fascinating was the fact that there were so many other areas which had not even been talked about. So, for example, I have known all my Bawa friends as basically people
What are
who...
Bawas?
Bawas it's the colloquial term for Parsis.
Parsis, okay.
So, Bawa, Bavi, I mean, if
Okay.
you talk to most of my friends, and with a couple of bad words thrown in.
Right.
But that's part of the lingo.
Yeah.
So most of my Bawa friends, they were people who enjoyed their steak and their burgers.
Yeah.
But if you told them that there was a passage within the Gathas which talked about the sacredness of the cow, then that is something which would absolutely fascinate them.
Yeah.
Because they never thought of it that way, right? But it does exist. Or for example, the idea that some of the passages could have commonality to the Atharva Veda was again something which was absolutely fascinating to me.
Yeah.
Or the notion that there could be a common land, that certain lands which are geographically located within India are mentioned within the Gathas. That is something again which was fascinating to me. We've all grown up, the ones who have sort of studied a little bit of Zoroastrian history, we know that Zarathustra came from an area which is now known as Khorasan, which is really Central Asia, Afghanistan, what used to be Bactria, Balkh, and that region. But to think that maybe that Greater Khorasan could have also encompassed parts of what we now consider as India, that again was very, very fascinating to me. The connections between the fact that Zarathustra did his initial rituals on the banks of the river Deity, and that you have a river in a tributary of the Jhelum in Kashmir, which is the Deity. Now those are the sort of things which sort of get my adrenaline pumping. And those were the things which I was specifically looking out for. That is it possible that over a period of time, because the religion became so completely separated from its Vedic cousins, that now you treat it as something which is we treat it as the precursor of the Abrahamic religions.
Correct.
Rather than treating it as something that evolved from Vedic thought. That really was the sort of mismatch that I was trying to address.
When I'm sure response to this is unanimous. I was reading the reviews on Amazon, 5 stars mostly. Have academics or philosophers or basically social historians who do this for a living, have they reached out with criticisms of this, considering कि यार आप बहुत speculation कर रहे हो इस चीज के ऊपर?
But I do not claim to be a scholar. I do not claim that I'm writing a non-fiction treatise of any sort. I'm not attempting to say that my word is the truth. I am writing it. I'm writing in the space of a Dan Brown, where I'm saying, is it possible? I mean, what was the Da Vinci Code about? The possibility that there could be a bloodline of Jesus Christ.
Right.
So that is not to say that there was a bloodline of Jesus Christ, but that was a speculation. See, ultimately, when we are writing in the world of fiction, there are people who call me a mythology fiction writer. There are those who call me a historical fiction writer. Others like to call me a conspiracy fiction writer. If I was to take the last definition, conspiracy fiction writer, then what is a conspiracy fiction writer? A conspiracy fiction writer is someone who is addressing one important question. And that important question is 2 words. What if? What if this were true? And if you look at most of the books in the Bharat series, they are addressing that what if Jesus Christ survived the crucifixion and came and lived in Kashmir? That was the Rozabal Line. Or what if the Mahabharata, the events narrated in the Mahabharata, were actually true? That was the Krishna key for you. Or what if there is a overlap between quantum theory and Vedanta? That is Keepers of the Kal Chakra for you. So all of them address a very, very delicious question, what if? And that is what I have tried to do with the Magicians of Mazda, which is that what if Zoroastrianism and dharmic thought are actually cousins?
Talking about cousins, you mentioned in the book that the Parsis could easily navigate the complicated world of social classes in during the time of the British East India Company, because they could drink their gins and like have their fun and wear their suits, which their Hindu contemporaries had some resistance to, accounting to their orthodoxy and whatnot, right? This specific case has been true throughout history, but this specific class of people, they still exist, right? What have they said about the book? Contemporary Parsis, now that they've been reintroduced to a part of their history in connection to dharmic faiths, what has their response been like?
So I've been receiving emails from around the world. I mean, in the last, I would say maybe last couple of weeks. The book has been out for only around 5 weeks.
Right.
So in the last 2 or 3 weeks, I've ended up receiving lots and lots of emails. And surprisingly from Parsis who are settled in places like the US and Canada. A young lady wrote to me recently and she said that, I was unaware of a lot of things because my father ended up marrying a Catholic woman. And as a result of which all of us were excommunicated and we could no longer follow the faith. As a result of which I grew up in an alien land, completely disconnected from my own culture, philosophy and roots. And she said, had it not been for your book, I would not have been reintroduced to a lot of this material. But the only difference was that rather than reading about it in a boring way, I read about it through a thriller. So I think this happens with virtually every book in the Bharat series. That I have had people who have come back to me and said, listen, the Krishna key taught me more about the Mahabharata than umpteen number of discussions with my grandmother and grandfather about the story, because you spin that into a narrative, and so it's packaged in a way whereby it becomes easy to absorb and read. So I think to a very great extent, the younger generation of Parsis are relating to it. And of course, I've also had a lot of the older lot of Parsis coming to me and saying, I thoroughly enjoyed reading the book. That is not to say that they are accepting what is the version that has been presented. But they're saying that, hey, listen, that was an exciting take. Either way, it doesn't matter to me. You may accept my version of events. You may disagree with my version of events. As long as you are entertained, I think I've done my job.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think with mythology, one of the problems that I faced growing up was that we were told the stories in a very fragmentary oral style, and bits and pieces हमें खुद accumulate करने पड़ते थे to arrive at some kind of a conclusion about who our ancestors were, what our gods are, right? What is our tradition, right? And even then, it's like you're stumbling in the dark because your religious texts happen to be, let's just say, inaccessible considering the dense language. and the gatekeepers who stand in front of them, refusing to make them accessible. Which is why I always have this fantasy that if you could just have mythology repackaged as video games. There's a video game called God of War, which shows Greek mythology and Norse mythology using this character called Kratos, right?
Yeah.
And you meet everyone from Zeus to Ares, and then you go to Norse mythology, and then you meet Thor, Jorgum Mandor, every one of those people. And if you can do the same with a thriller or a fun series, there's a lot of people who are very curious. It's just that they haven't been taught or introduced the right way. They've been sort of talked at.
Yeah.
They've been instructed in these matters. But when you remove the tension and you make it a fun book, you've no idea how many people you convert to actually embracing what is lost in their roots.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that has been the purpose of the Bharat series, that the idea has been to take things that you would never consider to be fun and present them in a way that is actually fun. And in the process, end up introducing people to nuggets of history, mythology, philosophy, spirituality, culture, anthropology, so many subjects, science. I mean, people tell me, are you a scientist when you wrote, when you wrote Keepers of the Kal Chakra? Are you an engineer by training? And the truth of the matter is I spent 3 months along with a dear friend from IIT who taught me, quantum theory 101, in order for me to be able to discover how I could relate it back to the notions of, let's say, duality, or the notions of, for example, that how does Vedanta relate to, let's say, Heisenberg? I mean, those were things which were alien concepts to me. But I think what people like me try and do is we take things which are out of the reach of common readers and we try and make them much more accessible. So, for example, in Keepers of the Kal Chakra, I'm trying to explain the notion of nothingness. Now, how do you explain nothingness to someone who hasn't really meditated or hasn't had that sort of training?
And through all things, through words.
Through words.
Yeah.
So, what I do in my books is I use metaphors. So, there is a scene where I describe a Buddhist monk, and he's telling the disciple, he says, that iPhone that you have? He says, just look at the screen while it's on. Do you see any smudges? And he says, no. Now he says, switch off the screen. And now, are there any smudges? He says, yes. So he says, that's nothingness. That till the time that you don't switch off, you can't see the reality for what it is. The fact that the screen is dirty is not something which is visible to you in ordinary course. You need to first switch off. Now, you may call that a very simplistic metaphor, but that's the only way that I can convey what I want to through that metaphor to a generation of readers who may not have been exposed to the material. Keepers of the Kal Chakra, for example, is talking about the idea that there could be two people. I mean, I've always been fascinated by this notion that you can have what are called entangled particles. And what at least quantum theory now tells you is that you could have an isolated particle in New Delhi and another one in New York, thousands of miles apart, but both behave exactly the same way, as if there is some sort of invisible umbilical cord which is connecting these two particles. And that was the theory on which Keepers of the Kal Chakra was based, that if you can have entangled particles, then can you have entangled human beings? So I think to a very great extent what we are all trying to do is take a lot of ingredients and cook you a khichdi which is easier for you to consume as well as digest.
Right.
Make it go down smoother.
Yeah.
That's what we are trying to do.
Talking about going down smoother, a part of the book has the protagonist down in a ditch in what is, I think, solitary confinement of some kind. उससे दो सवाल आते हैं. One, did you actually visit prisons in Tehran to do your research?
No.
Because that is very, very extensive. And second, the asides on surveillance, chained VPNs, right? Security systems in top secret laboratories, psychological ways of torture, all of those represent things you would normally not read in a fiction book, right? They might be mentioned in passing, but you have what you mentioned about spending 3 months with your friend at IIT, right?
Right.
It seems like you immerse yourself in those fields for months or weeks at a time to acquire that knowledge and just use that. Because when I read about chain VPNs or how someone is like using voice over internet protocol to like mask their voice, I assume that is where it ends. And then me as a reader would have to like highlight it and then read it and then come back to the book. But then you explain it as well, which I really enjoyed.
Vinamre, what I try to do is for any book in the Bharat series, let me start answering this question by first of all telling you the timeline.
Okay.
Most books in the Bharat series take me about 2 years end to end to actually research and write. Of that, the first 9 months is usually research. The next 3 months is plotting, where I actually put down every twist and turn in the tale. The next 6 months to 9 months is in terms of writing the book. And finally, the last 3 months is rewrites. So that's really what happens as far as the end-to-end timeline is concerned.
Do you use a notebook? Do you use your laptop or computer to do it?
So I'm totally dependent on my iCloud.
Okay.
So I will be writing in the car on my iPad or on my iPhone, which is part of the cloud. I will be working at home or in the office on my MacBook. I'm sounding like an ad for Apple right now. And then, once I'm actually done with the plotting, which then that's the time I start using a software known as Scrivener, which is basically a terrific tool for novelists, where they can actually create index cards for the story, and then move those index cards around in case they need to shuffle the story.
To make a non-linear narrative, you have
Absolutely. So once I'm done with Scrivener and I've actually written out the story, then I export the entire story into Microsoft Word, because all our old-time editors are not used to working with Scrivener. And so then the story then becomes a Word document. Now, the reason for telling you this is that the first 9 months, which is research, the nature of that research, and this is related to your question, the nature of that research will vary across stories. So, if you take something like, let's say, for example, Chanakya's Chant. Chanakya's Chant was simply a reading of the Arthashastra. In fact, multiple readings of the Arthashastra, and also a reading of a Sanskrit play by a guy called Vishaka Datta, called Mudra Rakshas, which is ostensibly on the life of Kautilya. So once I had read those two, and also ended up watching the multiple episodes of the Doordarshan serial by Chandra Prakash Dwivedi ji, those I think there were 10-15 odd episodes, that pretty much became the bedrock of research for Chanakya's Chant, and I felt empowered enough to be able to then go ahead and write the story. If you take, let's say, the Krishna key, the research became slightly different. It started with the reading of the Mahabharata, but then after that, it evolved into visiting places like Somnath and Dwarka and Mathura in order to be able to understand as to how I could weave those places into the narrative. If you take, let's say, a book like Keepers of the Kal Chakra, it was fundamentally a study of quantum theory and trying to bring myself up to speed with basic concepts so that I could write confidently about them. If I look at a book like the Sialkot Saga, which is 70 years of post-independence Indian history, I could have easily gone back to multiple history books, which I did. But to pick up the nuances of Bombay and Calcutta and how those cities would have felt like in, let's say, the 1950s or the 1960s was something that I could not get from history books. So I had to talk to people, interview people who had lived through those times. So, for example, I would go to my dad and say that, listen, when you came to Bombay in the 1960s, what was the place that was hep and happening? If you wanted to take someone out for dinner, then what would be the place? Or someone else who had lived in Calcutta saying, if you went to Victoria Memorial and you stood outside and had puchka pani, how much would puchka pani have cost you? Now, those are the little tantalizing details that make your story come alive. So the nature of research varies. In the case of Magicians of Mazda, the Vault of Vishnu, I ended up making 2 or 3 trips into China in order to,
And you're just simply going for the purpose of research. You're there. For example, I'm just going to cut you off just to add a little tangent so we can have a denser discussion. So you've got Mathura, Dwarka, right?
Yeah.
You've got Udvada, Navsari, right?
Yes.
You've got these places.
Yes.
You, Ashwin, go there.
Yes.
And what are you doing when you're going there? Are you starting with meetings? Are you looking at monuments?
No, it depends. Sometimes I will just wander around.
Aimlessly, no agenda?
Without an agenda. There will be days where I have a very, like for example, let's say a China visit can't be an unstructured visit. It has to be planned. But I was very, very clear that the maximum amount of time has to be spent at the White Horse Temple, maximum time at the Shaolin Monastery, and so on and so forth. And then what I'm looking for is tantalizing details that I could actually incorporate into the body of my story. In the case of Magicians of Mazda, I was able to do most of the India circuit, Udvada, Navsari. I was not able to cover Sanjan. So I spoke to people who had been into Sanjan. I had a trip planned into Tehran and in order to be able to cover Persepolis and all of that, and then COVID hit. So those plans got cancelled. Luckily, we are living in a world of the internet where virtual visits, etc., of many, many monuments is possible, where you can actually go and see a place in 3D.
Did you video call someone for that?
No, you don't need to. Like, for example, places like Persepolis, you can actually do a guided tour online. So nowadays, when you say that you need to visit, I say, hey, listen, be smart about your research. There are things that you need to do in terms of getting your feet on the ground. There are things that you would like to do because you feel that, no, it'll make my research come alive.
Yeah.
And there are things that you don't need to do. So, which probably a book or talking to someone. When I was writing the Krishna Key, almost about 7 or 8 chapters deal with Mount Kailash. I knew that I was not going to be able to make a trip to Mount Kailash. But you know what? There are so many people who make that trip and that expedition. So I ended up talking to 4 or 5 people. And I said, how does this work? How do those altitudes work? How does a parikrama work around the mountain? And all of that. So you can get all the details from people who know the place far better than you. So, I think you have to be intelligent and smart in terms of figuring out that what is the research that is going to be relevant to my story. And then the second part of your wisdom lies in knowing how much of that research you're actually going to use.
Yeah.
Because it's very easy to get excited about what you've discovered and then put it all in there. But very often you'll end up compromising on the story or the pace. So getting that balance is always the most difficult task of what writers do.
2 further questions arise from that. Number 1 is when it comes to this hybrid style of researching, which requires some parts digging deep and reading, some parts doing virtual tours, some parts speaking to people, has this come to you intuitively over the years? Did you actually train in this kind of research when you were growing up? That's number 1. And number 2, this is something I really wanted to ask you. For Magicians of Mazda, I'm sure there is a draft of throwaways that haven't made it to the book. right?
Yeah.
That would be interesting for our listeners or viewers to understand कि यार ये वाली बातें रह गई थी that I couldn't add because it didn't fit the narrative.
Okay, so as far as the training is concerned, honestly, I have no training. I am an MBA in finance.
That's why you laughed about my finance podcast joke in the start.
So, but the point is that I have no literary background whatsoever. I grew up in a Marwadi Baniya family. There is this very interesting nugget of information which is presented in the Vault of Vishnu, where I've talked about the merchants of Samarkand. And the merchants of Samarkand had this wonderful tradition that when a child was born in the house, a boy was born in the house, they would touch a drop of honey to the tongue of the child and a drop of glue to the palm of the child. The idea being that the child would grow up with a sweet tongue, capable of selling anything to anyone, and would have a sticky palm so that gold coins would stick to his palm.
This is the Baniya narrative?
This is the Baniya narrative, right? So the Baniya narrative is that when a child is born, rather than doing a mantra ucharan, what you repeat into the ears is debit and credit, debit and credit. The idea being that the child knows that those are the two most important words of his vocabulary in later years. So that was the cultural context in which I was born. But the parallel influence in my life was my granduncle, my real maternal grandfather's elder brother. He lived in Kanpur, and he would always say that, beta, you are in a Baniya environment, so Lakshmi ji will come naturally to you. She will always be there in your puja and you will always pujo her. But he would say that the relationship between Lakshmi and Saraswati is a very curious one. Lakshmi wants to go wherever Saraswati goes. If Saraswati is in this room, you will find Lakshmi peeping her head through the door, that why is Saraswati here? And if Saraswati gets up and goes away, then Lakshmi also gets up because she's curious, where has Saraswati gone? So he said, if you are even after Lakshmi in your life, the short way of attaining Lakshmi is through Saraswati. And he said the only deity in our Hindu pantheon of gods who can keep the two Devis on left and right is Ganesh, who can sit between Lakshmi and Saraswati. So he said, live your life like Ganesh. And Vinamre, I like to joke that that's probably why I look the way I do. Because I've lived my life like Ganesh. But the point is that what Nanaji did was he had this wonderful tradition of sending me a book to read every week. And it was not just sent, but when a new book came, I had to deliver a letter to the bearer of the book indicating what I read in the previous book.
So you had to summarize it.
Summarize it and say whether I liked it, didn't like it. If I liked it, why did I like it? If I didn't like it, why didn't I like it? It was the earliest form of a book review. And he expected that letter. And without that letter, the next book would not arrive. So during his lifetime, he sent me a little over 300 books. And this started from probably when I was 12. And it was a wide assortment of books, whether it was classics by Leo Tolstoy. I remember receiving War and Peace, which I couldn't get through. I remember receiving autobiography of a yogi, reading it once or twice, not understanding it, having to read it several times before I could even pick up some of the nuances. Mahabharat retold by Raja Gopalchari, and it was a very, very diverse and eclectic lot of books that came to me. In parallel to that was my mother. My mother was a complete bestseller freak. So whatever was the latest Frederick Forsyth or Robert Ludlum or Jeffrey Archer or Stephen King, she would read it and then pass it on to me. Yeah. So I think what was happening during my growing up years was that I was getting these two streams of books. From one of these books, I was getting a stylistic grounding, that I loved the fast-paced story, that thriller variety story, where you don't have to make an effort to turn the page, but the page turns itself. And on the other hand, I was getting a lot of books which covered things like philosophy, history, mythology, science. And I think I loved that content. Not the stylistic part of it, but the content part of it. And so what you see in my writing is actually an amalgamation.
That's true.
Of one stream of content and one stream of stylism. So the stylistic part of it I've borrowed from my mom's books, and the content I've borrowed, or the motivation for that particular content comes from my granduncle.
That's such a great ritual. I'm going to use it on my cousins. It's such a fantastic thing. You incentivize them with another book or something else by saying, hey, tell me how you like the first one. You also enable them to start writing.
Absolutely.
It's not just making a bunch of private readers.
Yeah.
Wow.
And in fact, had you asked me for the longest time, I mean, I started going into my dad's office to be trained in accounting and all of that from a very young age. I must have been 14 or 15. And we had an accountant, an old accountant there. We used to call him Munimji. And he was a traditional man, wore a topi and dhoti, kurta. And he would always see that I had one of my Nanaji's books in my hand. And the reason I used to have because whatever I had received, I would want to try and spend half an hour lunchtime going through a few more pages. And he would always tell me, he would say that, bookkeeping is more important than book reading. And he would say, if you must read, then read a balance sheet. What are you wasting your time with all of this for? So you see the dichotomy of the culture in that way. But the point is that had you asked me for the longest time, I came back from my MBA in 1993.
Where did you go?
I was at Yale.
Okay.
Between 91 and 93. I came back in 93. I started writing the Rozabal Line only in the year 2003, 2004. Yeah. So I was full-time involved in work. And had you asked me during those years that are you ever going to become a writer, I would have laughed at you. It was the furthest thing from my mind.
It was a decade of pure bookkeeping?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, but I did not know that Nanaji had hardwired my brain. He had rewired it. And that is something which you only realize when that first page, when that blank page is staring at you and you realize, I think it was Sidney Sheldon who said that that a blank page in front of you explains to you how difficult it is to be God. Because you suddenly have the power to decide what is going to happen in your character's life. So that blank page staring at you. And the fact that I was able to get started, and for someone who hadn't written anything more than a couple of thousand words, to suddenly get started on a novel of 100,000 words, I think that was, a miracle in itself. But probably not so miraculous, given the fact that my brain had already been trained in a certain way. So I think in that sense, what Nanaji allowed to happen was that I already had some part of my practical training in the world of business and finance and all of that. But he was getting the other side of my brain activated, which was the more creative side of me, which was the more romantic side of me, which was the more philosophical side of me.
Yeah. I forget who said it. I think it was Plato or Aristotle. He said that knowledge is nothing but remembering, something along those lines. So I think that despite your training, you remembered your early years and were able to incorporate that with your adult, go-getter attitude.
Yeah.
The other part was the what was left out of... you can have your coffee.
Yeah, sure.
The other part was what was left out of Magicians of Mazda. Because I was recently listening to a podcast by the guy Morgan Housel. He's written this book called Psychology of Money. It's very famous, right? Very famous book. And he says he never, ever deletes his throwaways. Right, he always keeps them for further use somewhere else. I'm sure you must have a treasure trove of that.
Oh yeah, of course. There are two stages in terms of non-use of information. One is at the research stage, where certain things, which even though they are beautiful and you would love to incorporate them, but you don't end up using them because you don't want to compromise the pace of a story.
Right.
So there would be a lot of research, which research notes, which would have occurred. For example, there was a ton of information that I wanted to actually bring in, which was related to the Islamic schism that happened between the Sunnis and the Shias.
When you say schism, you mean a divide of some
The
kind,
divide,
right?
where and how it was related to what happened within Persia. That what were the events unfolding in ancient Persia that resulted in that particular divide. And I actually had multiple pages of notes on that, but only a fraction of that got used. It was barely one page within the novel itself. Or, for example, the entire evolution of the Achaemenid dynasty, starting with Cyrus the Great. There were tons and tons of notes on that. Eventually, that entire period gets about 2 pages, 2.5 pages. And even with that, there are readers who come back to me and say, you know what? I mean, those italicized pages were dragging a bit. And I said, do you realize that I had 10 times of that quantity, which I needed to distill?
Right.
Because when I was writing the book, I was very clear in my mind that this novel, okay, if it's going to be 120,000 words, then not more than 25%, which means not more than 25 to 30,000 words will be of the parallel track. The vast majority of the book must be in the present day. The thriller element of the book must be maintained.
Right.
So there's a lot of material like that which was lost out at the research stage itself, which I didn't bring in because I didn't want to compromise on the narrative, on the pace or the style or the speed. The other part of it was the stuff that I end up discarding at the time when I'm doing my rewrites. Because typically when I'm rewriting a book, I'm reading it and then trying to be as clinical as possible about whether something really needs to be there. Does it actually progress the story or not? So there would be probably maybe around 15 or 20 odd chapters which have actually been completely discarded or partially discarded.
And do you intend to use some of them in future books or parts of this research? Do you have
it always happens. It always happens. In the Rozabal Line, there was a lot of material that was only presented as a couple of paragraphs within the book. But that material actually became relevant in the Magicians of Mazda. So, and luckily, because I'm an organized sort of chap, and everything of mine is indexed and cross-referenced, and, you know, all the research is right there. Yeah. Therefore, whenever I'm working on any book, all the previous research in any case is on hand. My research is at 2 or 3 levels. One is idea research. So unlike a lot of writers who sit down and say, okay, now मुझे अगली किताब लिखनी है, तो अब मैं सोचूंगा कि आइडिया क्या होना चाहिए. Whereas my personal view is कि our best ideas, जो they are all floating out there. तो आप वो आइडिया का जो ideation है, don't do that at the time when you are writing the book.
You should have a bank.
You should have a bank. So the way I maintain my idea bank is through an email journal, which is an email ID which only I email myself to. So, for example, you and I could be talking and something that you mentioned could strike me as very interesting. I'll email myself about that. Or I could be traveling down the road and I see an interesting site. I'll take a pic and email myself. I'm reading a book and a paragraph strikes me. I'll take a pic, email myself. I email myself YouTube videos. I email myself map links. I email myself interesting web articles, PDFs that I've come across, and so on and so forth. So during the last 10 or 12 odd years, I started that around 2006, 2007. So in the last 12, 13 years, I've ended up emailing myself maybe around 12,000 times. And what I try and do is I introduce tags into the body of the email so that the search function works better. So that is one part of it. And the second is when I actually get into the research for a book, at that point of time, I will take whatever information I have and I will make sure that it is on my Dropbox duly tagged, so that whether it is the idea bank or whether it is the research bank, both of them are available to me when I'm working on my next book.
That's incredibly organized.
I think that comes from probably because of the fact that there is that left brain, right brain stuff going on. So there is one part of me which is the guy who used to work on business plans and the guy who used to work on task lists and to-dos and so on and so forth. So I have always been organized. And that also translates, that also comes back into my writing.
Yeah. I can certainly see why, because the treatises that you write sometimes are very long and very detailed. और कोई भी ऐसे normally ऐसे कि मैं first draft लिख रहा हूँ जो मेरे मन में आ रहा है. You can't do that. I'm pretty sure there's a lot of things that you reference from the past that you have in your... Yeah. What is the messy part of it though?
The messy part of writing or the messy part of research?
Both.
If you ask me, let me not use the word messy. The toughest part is letting go. Because, you know, you've worked on a particular research angle for a couple of weeks. You've dragged out manuscripts that you thought you would never get your hands on. Once you've got that manuscript, then you've tried to find the appropriate translator to translate it for you.
Oh, so you work with translators?
Yes, I do.
So when you mentioned that you read a Sanskrit play, did you have a translator do it for you?
Yeah, in the case of Mudra Rakshas, there was already an English version available.
Okay.
So I never really had to read the Sanskrit version. And then I wasn't planning to quote from the Mudra Rakshas. I just simply wanted to know how does the story play out.
Okay.
But this is again something very interesting that we should talk about. That take, for example, a book like Chanakya's Chant. And people say, hey, listen, Ashwin, you know, when you talk about the life story of Chanakya, you've given it your own spin. And I say, okay, fine. Let's go back into our history books. Yeah. And let's talk about this character that is called Chanakya or Kautilya or Vishnugupta, whatever you might call him. The history books depend upon this work known as the Mudra Rakshas to be able to tell us the story of Chanakya. Because while Chanakya wrote a lot of books like the Arthashastra and the Niti Shastra, very little was written about him. So we depend on the Mudra Rakshas. The Mudra Rakshas is not written as a scholarly work. It is written as a Sanskrit play meant to be performed on stage. And Mudra Rakshas basically means the signet ring, the ring, the seal of the king. So it is written as a fictional play, but it obviously covers the life of Chanakya. But Vishaka Datta lived 700 years after Chanakya had already passed on. So what if Vishaka Datta was an ancient day Ashwin Sanghi who was liberally mixing fact and fiction in order to create an entertaining work? But now that has become de facto our history.
That's crazy.
So the point is, in some respects, I feel people ask me, they say that, you know, why are you so liberal in your views with historical narratives? Because I genuinely believe in that the words of wisdom of George Santana, who said that history is a pack of lies about events that never happened, written by people who were never there. So it's a version of events. And your version could possibly be at odds with mine. We have an event in 1857 that we know as the Great Rebellion of 1857. The same thing is not at all taught in English schools. And at college level, it is taught as the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857. Now, was it a Sepoy Mutiny or was it a Great Rebellion? That is where your own personal sensibilities are going to color the narrative. So when people ask me, how should we look at history? I say, listen, you go to a 3D movie and you put on a pair of 3D glasses and it suddenly looks three-dimensional because there are multiple beams of light but your pair of glasses is able to absorb those multiple streams and present them as a coherent whole. That's the way we should be reading our history, that we should be looking at it with a pair of 3D glasses. Let's look at all the narratives and then see as to what makes sense, because there's probably fact and fiction in every narrative.
Right, as opposed to treating it literally, which is what more people tend to do, right?
Exactly.
In the Magicians of Mazda, the eternally burning fire, the Iran Shah, is it an actual fire?
Oh, absolutely. You can still see it at Udvada.
Mm-hmm. It's there for public display?
Oh, absolutely. Of course, you can't go in case you are a non-Parsi.
Yeah.
But the Iran Shah has remained burning from the time that it arrived in Sanjan, and through the various moves, because of various political wrangling that happened, the fire had to be moved during the attacks of Sultan Begada. It had to be moved to Bharat, it had to be moved to Broch, it had to be moved to Navsari, and then eventually it found its final resting place in Udvada. And you can still see that fire burning, and that's the reason why it is treated in the tremendously respectful and sacred manner that it is.
Yeah. In the book you mentioned there are several Parsi families or dynasties who are basically charged with guarding the fire, right?
Yeah.
Does it actually now, does this tradition continue into modern times where actual, just for the lack of a better word or a term, like in the dharmic traditions, we've got mandirs ke andar mahant hote hain jaise, right? And they guard kuch traditions, or they guard like a certain shivling that maybe ek pandit ka beta kar raha hai, fir uska beta kar raha hai, uska beta kar raha hai.
Bilkul. Absolutely. And initially when the Parsis came here, they broke up into what were known as panths, which were actually groups. So, for example, let's say my friend Cyrus Brocha. Now, Cyrus Brocha doesn't probably even remember the fact that his surname Brocha comes from Bharuch, which was the other name for Bharuch. So, the panths were created, which were 5 different groups. But amongst those groups were those who were the original people who had created the flame. The priests that had created the flame on the banks of Sanjan and then continued to guard it down the ages. And they were known as the Sanjanas because they came from Sanjan. And different parts of that family have continued to preserve the Iran Shah down the ages. And there is, of course, a tremendous tradition. In other words, for example, there is cyclical rotation amongst the priests. So they get a certain number of weeks to be the guardians, and then the next group moves on. There is very exacting detail in terms of ritual purity, so that things like your breath. So you wear, now the mask has become a regular part of our lives in COVID times. But one always used to wonder as to why do Jain monks as well as Zoroastrian priests wear a mask, particularly when it is next to the Iran Shah. But that is the idea of basically maintaining ritual purity of the fire. So that tradition continues down the ages even today. And that is the reason why I think I was so fascinated by the idea that, okay, if one part of it is the traditional priests,
right?
But could there have been a subsect which was guarding an even deeper secret? And that is where the conspiracy comes in.
Right. With the Iran Shah, what is its global significance in the Zoroastrian faith? Is it the most significant religious / cultural monument or relic that they have, or are there other more powerful things that Zoroastrians sort of band together in the world?
Well, I think partly what has happened is that it has become such a numerically minuscule community that the smallest of traditions become a rallying point. The Iran Shah is probably the most famous amongst them. But the truth of the matter is that, for example, today there are far more ancient relics available to the Zoroastrians in Iran, for example. There are several Parsi fire temples, as well as dakhmas, which are right there in Iran itself, which are still surviving to this day.
Right.
Unfortunately, of course, over the years, except for the brief period of the Shah of Iran, where the Parsis were welcomed back with open arms into Iran, but otherwise for the better part of the last several centuries, they have been under assault from Islamic forces. And as a result of which, even that brief reprieve that the Shah of Iran was able to give them, after that, 1979, you had the Islamic Revolution, and the Ayatollah seized power. And once again, the Parsis became pariahs. Today, I think they would not be more than maybe around 84,000 in the entire population of Iran. And those are not counted, by the way, as Parsis. Parsis basically implies those Zoroastrians who came to India and then,
Correct.
and then, sort of grew in numbers. But if you look at the overall numbers, even within India, within Bombay, maybe around 35,000. Within India, about 55, 60,000. And then if you take US, Canada, and all parts of the world put together along with India, maybe about 100,000.
Yeah. Jis tarah se Jews consider, they have this birthright tour that they do, right? American Jews especially, like if you're a New York Jew or a New Jersey Jew, you go to Israel and like it's a free birthright trip where you discover like what your tradition is, what your culture are. You visit Jerusalem, right? You visit all the great things that you can possibly do to understand what your culture is, where you come from, right? Where you migrated from, in essence. Aise hi, you mentioned in passing in the book a bunch of times about how jo actual indigenous Zoroastrians hain, jo Iran mein reh rahe hain, them and the Parsis in India, how they tried to make contact several times.
Yes.
Do those lines of contact still exist? And if they do, are they still strictly on a religious basis?
No, those lines of contact actually sort of got diluted several hundred years ago.
Okay.
It was during the probably the time of Changa Shah or Changa Asa, depending upon whether you're reading the Indian version of the name or the original Zoroastrian version of the name, that Navzari became the hub, and expeditions were sent out into Iran. Because the Parsis of India felt that they had lost their cultural moorings and their roots from Iran. And so they reached out to the priests of Iran in order to educate them about their religious practices. And these instructions flowed. Those were very difficult times. To get in and out of Iran was very difficult. To get the written word out of Iran was also very difficult. And so a set of instructions flowed from Iran to India, which were known as the Rivayats. And I'm told that there were about maybe 25 such Rivayats that actually came in over the space of a couple of hundred years. But after that, the numbers had become so minimal, so minuscule, that that tradition also died out. So to a very great extent, I think it is places, physical places, like let's say the Iran Shah, or for example Persepolis, or for example the few remaining fire temples in Iran. Those are the places that can produce that feeling of being culturally moored in some ways. Navzari, because of the great library and the ancient texts. I think preservation of these would be extremely important. Even take, for example, what we started out with, which is dew. The Dakhma is no longer consecrated, but luckily it has been given the status of a heritage site by UNESCO, which means, in other words, it will get preserved.
Right.
That is very important, because the number of things that are available in order to link back the Parsis to their roots are becoming more and more limited as time is going by.
I was speaking to a Parsi friend, and he was talking about how he lives. I don't know. He doesn't live in the other Parsi colony. He lives in another one, and he was.
There are many in Bombay. There is Khusro Bagh. There is Manik Bagh. There is the Parsi colony of Dadar. There are about maybe 6 or 7 of them.
He lives in one of them, and he was saying that, very modern guy. He was saying, despite the fact that we are super modern, like some of the Parsis still look down on us marrying someone else. And if I were to speculate, I think it's probably because of the numbers and how limited they have, how limited their religious monuments, their social institutions are. So there's a need to preserve.
Self-preservation kicks in.
Yeah.
And I don't blame them for having that approach. Unfortunately, it is ironically working against them because there are very, very few ideal mates available within the community. And the problem is that the ones so the moment you marry outside, then there is a problem in terms of allowing the children into the faith. This is particularly true of those who are based in India. Parsi communities which are based outside of India have actually become far more liberal in terms of allowing people into the faith. And the funny thing is that if you read about Zoroastrian history during Sasanian times, it was a religion that you could be converted into.
Yeah.
So Zoroastrianism, as it existed during Sasanian times, was a religion that you could be converted into. It was only pursuant to coming to India that they felt the need to insulate themselves.
Right.
Which is, in my opinion, a very common sense approach that, hey, listen, we want to preserve whatever we have. But that's working against them now.
I see. And as far as the rest of the book is concerned, the Zoroastrian god Ahura, Mazda Ahura, his line, good words, good thoughts,
good deeds,
good words, good deeds, good actions.
Yes.
Is that accurate?
Good thoughts, good words, good deeds.
Right. That line is that definitive? If you had to do like a elevator pitch, what is this about? For example, for say Sanatan Dharma or our tradition, we usually say the first line that comes to our mind is, Karm karo, phal ki chinta mat karo. It's just like that one line that tries to encapsulate, again, a very complex social institution, right?
Yes.
But do you think that modern Parsis base themselves around this line? How pervasive is this line in modern culture?
I would say that they are the community is far more morally anchored than most.
Yeah.
The value of things like education, the value of charity, the value of the value of being grounded in terms of a certain code of ethics. I think this is something that I definitely do see within modern day Parsis. Now, that is not to say that we should create this idealized construct of the community, because at the end of the day, they are living in the modern world.
Right.
So they cannot be very far away from a reflection of what is going on around us. But I would say that the vast majority do have very, very strong moral anchors, ethical anchors.
Right.
And we see that, and that's probably one of the reasons why. Partly it might also be on account of the fact that there is so much of emphasis on education. I mean, you see, this is such a minuscule community, but they account for such a huge mind share in terms of what they've achieved. The best of lawyers, the best of doctors, the best of businessmen.
Yeah.
The
Even
best
a Vedic
of
astrologer, Bejan Daruvala.
Yeah. I mean, so there are so many. They just account for such a huge mind share, despite the fact that they are so minuscule. That has to say something.
Any particular challenges you had when you were writing this book, specifically about outcries? Because it isn't like you are a Parsi yourself.
Yeah.
And I'm only asking that because when you take on a mammothian task like this to literally combine history with extremely interesting asides and do it on a community that is not your own, that you've lived around, right? Any challenges around that?
There are. It's like me writing the Rozabal Line. I'm not a Christian.
Yeah.
But I was attempting to cover the life of Jesus Christ and then trying to superimpose a hypothesis, which was that there was a survival after the crucifixion. And that does become a challenge being an outsider. The same applies, I would say, when I was probably writing Keepers of the Kal Chakra, because I'm not a practicing Tantric Buddhist, but I was trying to look into Tantric Buddhism as an outsider and try and figure out as to whether it could have been related in some ways to Shiva Tantra and how both of those disciplines could possibly correlate with quantum theory. So I think those challenges are always there. I think whenever we are talking about stories that are dealing with people's faith, I think there are 2 or 3 golden rules to be followed. And I would say number 1 is the disclaimer in the beginning of a book, which says, look, please don't treat this as history or don't treat this as a factual narrative. Even where you come across bits which sound factual, treat it as fiction. I think that's very important. Number 2, I would say, is that you owe it to your reader to do your research. That's again very important. You know, when during my years growing up, after I wrote the Rozabal Line, people asked me, press walas in particular, that, you know, you're an MBA in finance with no literary background, no BA in literature, no MA in creative writing, and you decide that you're going to write a theological thriller based on Jesus Christ. What is your qualification to write it? Yeah. And I said, you know, during my growing up years, my mother always used to say that I was a damn good liar. So we as fiction writers are ultimately spinners of yarns. But there is a proverb which says that if you're going to tell a lie, then tell the lie as close to the truth as possible, because then it makes your lie more believable. Right? So research is what makes your lie believable. So I think the second part of it is do your research. The third part of it is that rather than approaching the subject with a sense of sensationalism, approach it with a sense of respect. Because that shows up in your writing. So if you have taken up that subject and you, rather than simply attempting to stir up a sensation or a controversy, instead you are approaching that subject with genuinely a deep sense of respect regarding inquiry, then that will tend to show up in the way that you write your passages. That is the third. And I would say the fourth, that treat your reader with respect, because any book in the Bharat series is not meant to be just the story in and of itself. It is meant to be the starting point of an exploration. And that is the reason I provide you with exhaustive research resources. The idea being, and many of those research resources run counter to my own narrative. The idea is that I want you to dig into those sources and come across the same material that I came across, and then make up your mind for yourself as to whether you agree with my version or some alternative version. So I think if you can do those 3 or 4 things, then in that case it becomes far easier to be accepted.
Wow. As someone who deals in inflammatory language for a living, mostly YouTube titles, I really, really enjoyed that. Ashwin, before we part, I'm not going to have you give advice to young writers, because I'm sure you've done that 3,000, 10,000 times. But I will say one thing though. Are there any insights beyond the ones that I've obviously gleaned from this that offline or non-fiction writers can take from this? Why? Because I think your methods for writing fiction, I mean, you invent your characters and whatnot, and you let them marinate and they have their own stories. But there is obviously an element of genuine non-fiction research. So for a purely non-fiction writer, even based on your writing process, or the way you assemble your books, organize your books, are there takeaways that people can take from that, where they don't have to have so many flights of fancy?
Yeah. Is it okay if I answer this in bullet points?
Bilkul, koi dikkat nahi hai.
I would say point number one, there are too many people I come across who talk about writing, but they don't write. This is very important. There is a difference between those who want to be writers and those who are writers. So my personal view is, rather than waiting for a novel to come along, just start the process of writing.
A tweet is enough.
A tweet is enough. A Facebook post that is well thought out. It could be 2 paragraphs long, but it's enough. Maybe it could be the process of maintaining your own journal. It could be writing an odd article once in a while. But it's a process of evolution. Get started on writing. That is number one. Build up that discipline. I think number 2 is that I feel that too many people are worried about what others think. So they are worried will someone laugh at what I've written? And let me put it this way, it doesn't matter how famous you become, there is someone who's going to laugh at you, and there is someone who is going to criticize your work. The relationship between the author and the critic is the relationship between the lamppost and the dog. The lamppost knows exactly what the dog is going to do. Okay? And that's the nature of the creative industry. How many times have you come out of a movie theater saying, wow, what a movie, but you can hear someone saying, "Arey yaar, itna exciting nahi tha."
And especially in the urinal, because you can I don't want to hear your opinions. I'm trying to let the movie marinate in my head.
Exactly. Yeah. So the point is that is the very nature of creative work. Yeah. It's sometimes the feeling that you have is that you have been stripped naked and you've been made to stand on a platform where people can throw rocks at you. That's how exposed and vulnerable you are.
Shout out to Stone Pelters, guys.
So the point is, don't worry about what people are going to think.
Yeah.
Had I been worried about the reactions to the Rozabal Line, I would never have written the Rozabal Line. So I think that is the second very important takeaway, that start writing, but write what you think is going to work for you. Don't be worried about other people's observations, comments, or criticisms.
What about the nature of feedback then? How does that work?
I'm going to come to that.
Okay.
The third part of it, I feel, is that too many people think that writing of the sort that I do is an art. Actually, it's not an art. It's a craft. People think that, this morning I'll get up and I'll have this blank piece of paper in front of me and I'll start writing. An artist can do that with a blank canvas. Just start working on the brushwork. But on the other hand, I see myself more as the carpenter who's making a chair. His first chair is not going to be as good as his 100th. And his 100th is not going to be as good as the 1000th. He starts refining that craft as he goes along. So all the nuances of things like plotting, getting the twists in your mind, figuring out what is going to be a cliffhanger, figuring out what will get your reader to turn the page, those are intrinsic parts of a craft which you will learn as you will go along. I always like to call myself work in progress, because all I'm hoping for with every novel is that I'm 5% better. That's all. And it's a journey of evolution that I'm learning along the way as I'm going along. If you see the way I wrote the Rozabal Line, it was nothing in comparison to the way I wrote Chanakya's Chant. I was far more organized by the time I wrote my second novel. So that is the third very important element. That remember that it is a craft and you need to hone your skills. The fourth point that I want to bring up is that there are writers who think that somehow or the other inspiration will strike me this morning. The only thing that has worked for me is being organized. When I want inspiration, it's never there.
Yeah.
So what then makes you chug along is organization. The Sialkot saga was a book which was 150,000 words long, and it had 150 chapters. You know how I wrote that book? I had a spreadsheet in front of me with every chapter outlined on one line of the spreadsheet. And I set myself a target of 150 days of writing 150 short stories of 1,000 words or less, which would link up together into a novel.
You wrote short stories every day for 150 days?
Exactly. And that's how the Sialkot saga was written. That every day I need to get that one story churned out. Because if you read every chapter, you'll realize that you can read it on its own like a short story. So that is the fourth takeaway that I have. The fifth takeaway, don't lose the day job. I know it's easy to say, oh, I'll become this very famous writer, and I will remember one thing: writers can write books faster than publishers can write checks. So it's a long, long time before your income will be such that it can sustain you.
Yeah.
And it's far easier to write at any time. My good friend Amish Tripathi wrote Immortals of Meluha when he was traveling back and forth from work to the house in the car. I wrote the Rozabal Line between 10 o'clock and 12:30 midnight every night because I was still clocking in a full day of work. So it's very important. It's damn difficult to write when you are hungry. Bhook aisi cheez hai ki it will not allow you to write. So don't lose the day job. And finally, my last takeaway is that if for some reason you are amongst those lucky ones that become successful and you are appreciated, just have the humility and the grace to keep your feet on the ground and to realize that every word that you wrote, you didn't write. It was a blessing from Ma Saraswati. You were a medium and the words came to you from her. Because the day you forget that, the flow will stop.
Wow. I'm just going to say this. Ladies and gentlemen, this was Ashwin Sanghi on Dostcast. What a fucking pleasure to have you on.
Delighted to be here. And I hope that we are going to do more of these chat sessions.
100%. Even just beyond the books. Wow, Ashwin. Just absolutely blown away. People can buy The Magicians of Mazda on Amazon, everywhere else. They can follow you on, do you have a Twitter handle or an Instagram?
Yeah, so at Ashwin Sanghi on Twitter, at Ashwin.Sanghi on Instagram.
Yeah.
And my Facebook page is also Ashwin Sanghi.
Fantastic.
So, yeah.
I'm still blown away. I'm still just taking it all in. Wow. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vinamre. Delighted and a pleasure.